The table has just been finished. It runs the length of the south lawn at Ashcombe Hall, laid under a striped canvas awning that keeps the worst of the July sun from the linen, and it is, in this moment, perfect. The cloth is white damask, pressed so precisely that the folds catch the light in straight, even lines. The silver has been polished until it holds the sky. There are 3 kinds of glasses at every place setting, one for water, one for hock, one for claret, and each one has been breathed on and rubbed with a soft cloth until no thumbprint remains. Ice, carried up from the ice house in blocks wrapped in sacking, sits packed around bottles of champagne in silver coolers, sweating faintly in the heat. Roses, cut from the walled garden at 6 o'clock that morning while the dew was still on them, sit in low silver bowls down the centre of the table. White and pink, and the deep red variety that Lady Pemberton favours, and their scent mixes with the smell of cut grass and warm canvas. It is 12:30. In 30 minutes, Lady Pemberton and her guests, perhaps 20 of them, in white muslin and pale linen, carrying parasols, will come across the lawn from the drawing-room, laughing about something, and they will sit at this table, and they will remark on how effortless it all looks, how simple, how very like a painting. A summer luncheon on an English lawn, the kind of scene that will be reproduced in watercolour and postcard, and, a century and a half later, in soft focus photographs on the internet, captioned with words like timeless and elegant and the good old days. Nobody arriving at this table in 30 minutes will think about how it came to exist. That is rather the point of it. The entire purpose of this table, gleaming and effortless under its canvas awning, is to erase every trace of the labour that produced it, so thoroughly that the erasure itself becomes invisible. And beneath that white linen, beneath that untroubled silver, beneath the very idea of an English summer as something soft and golden and unhurried, there is a machine. A machine made of women, most of them under 20, most of them awake since before 5 o'clock that morning, most of them not permitted to be seen by the guests who are about to sit down to eat. And the story of what it actually took to lay this table is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any painting of an English summer has ever let on. What you are actually looking at when you look at this table is a masterpiece of concealment. And tonight, we are going to see what was concealed. There is a fascination right now, a very modern fascination, with the aesthetic of the Victorian summer. You have seen it. The costume dramas with their sun-dappled lawns and their linen dresses, the wedding boards pinned with garden party inspiration, the soft, hazy nostalgia for a world of croquet and lemonade and long, slow afternoons that never seem to end. It is a truly beautiful image, and it has become one of the most widely borrowed aesthetics of the last decade, appearing in everything from bridal fashion to home decor, to the particular kind of soft, warm-toned photography that fills certain corners of the internet. What almost none of that imagery acknowledges is where the image actually came from. Not from leisure, from labour. Specific, exhausting, physically punishing labour, performed almost entirely by working-class women and girls who lived below the very houses whose lawns now populate our fantasies, and whose names appear nowhere in the paintings, the postcards, or the pinboards that romanticize the world they built with their own 2 hands. This is that labour, put back together honestly. Not to diminish the women who lived it, and not to suggest that a summer luncheon on an English lawn was some kind of crime. To see clearly, for perhaps the first time, what the word effortless actually cost, and who paid the bill. The scale of domestic service in Victorian England makes this an unusually significant story to tell honestly. By the middle decades of the 19th century, domestic service had become the single largest category of female employment in the country, encompassing well over 1 million women and girls at any given time. a workforce larger than the entire textile industry that history books more commonly associate with Victorian labor and Victorian labor conditions. And yet the popular imagination of the era, then and now, has focused overwhelmingly on the drawing rooms and garden parties that this enormous, largely invisible workforce made possible, rather than on the workforce itself. Part of this imbalance stems from the sources available to historians. The family upstairs left diaries, letters, photographs, an entire archive of self-documentation, preserved specifically because their lives were considered worth remembering. The servants below stairs left considerably less, not because their experiences mattered less, but because literacy, leisure time, and the assumption that one's own life was worth recording in writing were all, themselves, markers of privilege that most domestic servants simply did not possess in equal measure. What survives from below stairs, the occasional memoir written decades later by a servant who achieved some later measure of security and reflection, the household account books that record wages and duties in the driest possible terms, the rare surviving letter, must be pieced together carefully to reconstruct a picture that the family's own more abundant records never needed to include. This is that reconstruction, built from what survives, filled in with the careful, informed extrapolation that social historians have developed through decades of studying the pattern of Victorian domestic service across hundreds of households, similar to the fictional Ashcombe Hall. Alice Tanner did not exist, precisely, as a single documented individual. She represents, instead, a composite drawn from the genuine, well-documented experiences of thousands of young women who did exist, whose collective reality her story attempts to honor with the specificity and care that no single surviving record could provide on its own. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you prefer the real version to the polished one, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep making these. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me which era you find most fascinating. I read every one of them. Let us begin where every Victorian servant's day began, long before the roses were cut, with a girl named Alice. Her name, for the purposes of this evening, is Alice Tanner. She is 19 years old. She has been in service since she was 13, when her father died of a fever that swept through their village in Dorset and left her mother with 3 children and no income beyond what could be earned taking in mending. Alice was the eldest. She was sent into service because service meant a wage, a roof, and one fewer mouth to feed at her mother's table, and because a placement had been found for her through a cousin who already worked in the laundry at Ashcombe Hall. 6 years later, Alice is the under-laundry maid at Ashcombe Hall, a large country house in Hampshire owned by Sir Edward Pemberton and his wife, Lady Pemberton, and staffed below stairs by 12 indoor servants who keep the house, the family, and the family's considerable summer entertaining running with a precision that the family itself rarely has cause to think about. Alice reports to the head laundry maid, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who is not actually married but has earned the courtesy title that comes with seniority in her position, and together they manage the washing, starching, and ironing of everything the household requires, which, in July, during what the family calls the season, is an enormous and unrelenting quantity of linen. Alice is 5 feet 3 inches tall. She weighs perhaps 105 pounds. She arrived at Ashcombe Hall a soft, round-faced child of 13, and 6 years of physical labor have reshaped her considerably. Her forearms are permanently reddened from the heat of the copper and from contact with strong soda and soap. There are small, pale scars scattered across the backs of both hands from the countless times a hot iron has brushed against her skin in the course of a long day's pressing. Her shoulders have developed a slight forward curve from bending over the washtub and the ironing board for 10 to 14 hours a day, a posture that Mrs. Pruitt shares, more pronounced, after 22 years in the same position. Alice's hair, which was a rich chestnut brown when she arrived, has not changed colour, but it has thinned slightly, and there are days when it comes away in the brush more than she would like to notice. Ashcombe Hall itself is a substantial but not ostentatious property, built in the previous century and expanded twice since, most recently to add the additional guest bedrooms and the enlarged kitchen wing that Lady Pemberton's growing appetite for entertaining has necessitated. Sir Edward inherited the estate from his father and has, in the 15 years since, maintained rather than dramatically expanded its fortunes, a comfortable but not extravagant position within the broader hierarchy of English landed gentry. The household below stairs reflects this middling prosperity, substantial enough to require 12 indoor servants and additional outdoor staff, but not so grand as to maintain the truly enormous staffs, 40 or 50 servants, that the very greatest aristocratic houses of the period employed. Alice's specific responsibilities, beyond the core work of washing and ironing, extend to a range of smaller tasks that fill whatever gaps remain in her schedule. She assists with mending across the household, not merely the fine needlework reserved for more senior hands, but the ordinary repair of servants' uniforms and everyday household linens. She occasionally assists in the kitchen during periods of exceptional demand, an arrangement that Mrs. Halloran and Mrs. Pruitt negotiate between themselves, based on whichever department faces the heavier burden on a given day. She has learned, over 6 years, a working knowledge of nearly every domestic task performed below stairs, an education acquired not through formal instruction, but through the simple necessity of filling whatever labor gap a given day happens to present. There is one small thing about Alice that nobody at Ashcombe Hall knows except Alice herself. In the bottom of her trunk, under her second uniform and her Sunday dress, she keeps a stub of pencil, worn down to 2 inches, and a small bundle of paper scraps, offcuts saved from the housekeeper's account books and smoothed flat. At night, after the other servants have gone to sleep, when she has an inch of candle left and the energy to stay awake past it, Alice practices her handwriting. She copies out words from a newspaper someone left in the servants' hall. She writes her own name over and over, trying to make the letters smaller and more even. She's teaching herself, in secret, in the hope that one day her writing will be neat enough and her manner refined enough that she might be considered for the position of lady's maid, which requires literacy, discretion, and a kind of quiet elegance that a laundry maid is not generally permitted to develop. It is a modest ambition. It is also, for a girl in Alice's position, an almost audacious one, and she guards the hope of it as carefully as she guards the candle stub itself. This is the morning of a day in July, 1875. Lady Pemberton is hosting a luncheon on the south lawn for 20 guests, the third such entertainment in as many weeks, part of a summer season that will not properly end until the family departs for their shooting estate in Scotland in August. The temperature by midday will reach the high 70s, unusually warm for Hampshire, and the heat will matter enormously to what happens below stairs today, though it will barely register to the guests seated under their canvas awning, sipping iced champagne in the shade. Alice has been awake since 20 minutes past 5, and by the time the last guest rises from that gleaming table this evening, she will have been working, without meaningful pause, for close to 18 hours. The performance is about to begin. It always begins the same way, with a girl, alone, before dawn, and a great deal of work that no one upstairs will ever see. Which brings us to the question that nobody in the drawing room ever asked, but every servant below stairs was quietly managing all day long. The question of what an English summer actually felt like from the inside. If you picture a hot day in Victorian England, you likely picture it from the family's vantage point: cool drinks in the shade, linen dresses, a gentle, sun-warmed idleness. The heat in this picture is a pleasant backdrop to leisure. It is something to be enjoyed from a wicker chair with a glass of something cold close at hand. Alice's experience of the same July heat bears almost no resemblance to that picture. She wakes at 20 minutes past 5 in an attic room on the top floor of Ashcombe Hall that she shares with 2 other maids. The attic rooms sit directly under the slate roof, and slate absorbs heat through the day and releases it slowly through the night, which means that by July, Alice's bedroom does not meaningfully cool between one scorching day and the next. She sleeps, most nights, in a thin shift on top of the bedclothes rather than under them, in a room where the air is close and still and smells faintly of hot dust and her own sweat and the sweat of the two other girls sharing the space. The single small window positioned high in the sloped ceiling opens perhaps 6 inches, and even that small gap does little against a room that has been baking under a slate roof since noon the previous day. She dresses in the dark, and dressing is its own small ordeal in this weather. Her uniform, like every servant's uniform of the period, was designed with no consideration whatsoever for the comfort of the person wearing it in summer heat. She puts on a chemise, a corset laced snugly enough to hold her figure in the expected line, though not as tightly as the corsets worn upstairs, since a laundry-maid's corset must allow for bending and reaching that a lady's corset does not need to accommodate. Over the corset goes a petticoat, and over the petticoat goes her print cotton work dress, long-sleeved and high-necked, regardless of the season, because a servant's arms and throat were not considered appropriate to display, heat or no heat. Over the dress goes an apron, heavy and full, tied at the waist and around the neck. Stockings held with garters. Boots laced to above the ankle. By the time Alice is fully dressed at 5:30 in the morning, she is already wearing more fabric, more layers, and more structural restriction than most modern people would tolerate for a formal winter event. And she will wear all of it, without relief, through a July day that will reach the high 70s before noon, and considerably warmer than that in the rooms where she actually works. Because the rooms where Alice works are, without exception, the hottest rooms in the entire house. The laundry itself, a separate outbuilding connected to the main house by a covered walkway, contains 2 great coppers, essentially enormous fixed cauldrons set into brick housings with fires under them, which must be kept burning and boiling for most of the working day during a heavy wash. The heat that radiates from a copper at full boil is considerable even in January. In July, combined with the ambient outdoor temperature and the poor ventilation of a Victorian laundry building designed primarily to contain steam and prevent it from damaging the rest of the house, the working temperature inside the laundry by mid-morning regularly exceeds 90 degrees, and on the hottest days, closer to 100. Alice works inside that heat, fully clothed in corset and long sleeves and heavy cotton and apron for 10 to 14 hours, depending on the day's demands. There is no relief valve. There is no moment at which the heat becomes optional. The linen must be washed regardless of the temperature outside, because the family requires clean linen regardless of the temperature outside. And the physical reality of Alice's body inside that clothing, inside that room, is a reality that nobody in the drawing room, sipping their iced champagne under the canvas awning, will ever be asked to imagine. She sweats continuously through the working day, a fact that she manages the way every servant of the period managed it, through a combination of endurance and small, private strategies. She keeps a cloth tucked into her apron string to wipe her face and neck without staining her collar. She drinks small beer or weak tea whenever a break allows, because the water from the pump nearest the laundry has a faintly metallic taste that Mrs. Pruitt distrusts, though neither of them could explain precisely why. She has learned to recognize the particular light-headedness that comes before she is at real risk of fainting in the heat, a sensation she has felt perhaps a dozen times over 6 summers, and she has learned to sit down abruptly on the nearest surface when it arrives, because a fainting laundry maid falling against a copper of boiling water and lye is a genuine and serious danger, one that Mrs. Pruitt has seen happen twice in her 22 years, once with lasting injury to the girl involved. The heat does not end when the working day ends. It follows Alice back up to her attic room, which has been absorbing sun through the slate roof all day, and will not meaningfully cool until well past midnight, if it cools at all before the sun rises again and begins the cycle anew. She sleeps in heat. She wakes in heat. She works in heat that exceeds anything the family upstairs will experience, even at the height of the afternoon. And she does all of it in clothing that was designed by people who never once considered what it might be like to wear it while standing over a boiling copper in July. The image of the Victorian summer as something soft, golden and unhurried is an image constructed entirely from the vantage point of the lawn. From the vantage point of the laundry, the attic and the kitchen, the same season was one of the most physically punishing stretches of the entire working year. There is a physiological dimension to this that deserves attention, because the modern understanding of heat stress makes clear just how dangerous Alice's working conditions actually were. Sustained exposure to temperatures above 90 degrees, combined with heavy physical exertion and clothing that traps heat against the body rather than allowing it to escape, creates genuine risk of heat exhaustion and, in its more severe form, heat stroke, a condition that can cause organ damage or death if not addressed quickly. Alice does not know this in clinical terms. What she knows is the specific, familiar sensation that precedes the danger. A tightening at the temples, a greying at the edges of her vision, a sudden heaviness in her limbs that arrives without warning after hours of steady work in the heat. She has learned to recognize this sensation the way a sailor learns to read an approaching storm, and she has learned that ignoring it carries genuine physical risk. Mrs. Pruitt, in her 22 years overseeing the Ashcombe laundry, has developed her own informal protocols for managing the heat. Protocols passed down through generations of laundry staff with no medical training whatsoever, but considerable practical wisdom accumulated through hard experience. Small beer or weak tea at regular intervals, because plain water alone, she believes, does not adequately replace what is lost to sweat. A belief that happens to align reasonably well with what a modern physiologist would recognize about electrolyte replacement, though neither Mrs. Pruitt nor anyone else at Ashcombe Hall would use that language. Brief pauses, taken standing near the laundry's single open door where a faint cross breeze occasionally penetrates the thick summer air. A firm insistence that any girl feeling unsteady sit down immediately rather than push through. A rule born from watching, twice in her career, a fainting laundry maid fall dangerously close to an open flame or a copper of scalding water. None of these measures make the work safe in any sense a modern occupational health inspector would recognize. They simply make it survivable. And survivability for a below-stairs servant in Victorian England was the standard against which working conditions were measured. Comfort was never part of the equation. The attic quarters where Alice sleeps present their own distinct summer challenge, separate from but connected to the heat she endures during her working hours. Servants' bedrooms, in the architectural logic of a house like Ashcombe Hall, occupy the least desirable space available. Tucked immediately under the roofline, where the ceiling slopes sharply enough that Alice cannot stand upright except in the center of the room, and where the proximity to the slate above means the space absorbs and retains heat with an efficiency that no Victorian architect considered worth addressing, since the comfort of servants' sleeping quarters ranked low among the considerations that shaped a country house's design. The three girls sharing Alice's room have developed their own small strategies for managing the summer heat, strategies passed down informally from one generation of junior servants to the next. They leave the room's single small window propped open with a folded scrap of cloth throughout the night, accepting the risk of insects in exchange for whatever marginal air movement the gap provides. They have learned that lying perfectly still, rather than tossing restlessly against the heat, seems to help marginally, a piece of folk wisdom that happens to align with the genuine physiological reality that unnecessary movement generates additional body heat in conditions where the body is already struggling to cool itself effectively. They keep a small basin of water near the bed, dipping a cloth to press against the forehead and wrists in the deepest, most uncomfortable hours of the night, a modest comfort that provides temporary relief without requiring any resource more elaborate than what their limited circumstances allow. Sleep itself, under these conditions, becomes a real and difficult achievement, and Alice has learned over 6 summers that the quality of her rest during the hottest weeks of July bears little resemblance to what she experiences during the cooler months. She wakes more frequently through the night, drifts into a lighter, less restorative sleep than her body actually requires after 18 hours of physical labor, and rises each morning already carrying a degree of accumulated fatigue that the ordinary demands of her position would be difficult enough to manage without this additional burden layered on top. Now, the laundry itself, because the laundry was where the performance of the pristine white summer table was manufactured, and it was manufactured through a process that most modern people, accustomed to a machine that runs on electricity and requires perhaps 10 minutes of human attention, would find almost unimaginable. Washing day, in a household the size of Ashcombe Hall during the height of the summer entertaining season, is not a single day. It is closer to 3 days of continuous, escalating labor. And Alice and Mrs. Pruitt, along with a scullery maid borrowed from the kitchen when the workload demands it, are the entire workforce responsible for producing every piece of clean linen the household requires. Sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, including the enormous damask cloth that will cover the garden luncheon table this afternoon. Napkins by the dozen. The family's personal linen, their shirts and undergarments and stockings, the servants' own uniforms. All of it passes through Alice's hands. The first stage is sorting, which happens the evening before the main wash. Items are separated by fabric, by color, and by degree of soiling, because different categories require different treatment, and washing them together would ruin the more delicate items or fail to clean the heavily soiled ones adequately. The finest linens, the family's personal items, and the good table linen are set aside for the most careful handling. Heavily soiled kitchen cloths and the roughest servants' garments go into a separate category entirely, sometimes pre-soaked overnight in cold water to loosen the worst of the dirt before the main wash even begins. The wash itself begins before dawn on washing day, because the coppers must be filled and brought to the boil, a process that itself takes the better part of an hour once the fires are lit. Water must first be pumped or carried from the nearest supply, gallon after gallon, to fill 2 coppers that each hold in the range of 20 gallons. That is close to 320 pounds of water, carried or pumped by hand before a single garment has even entered the wash. Soap at Ashcombe Hall is a commercial bar soap purchased from a grocer rather than made on the premises, which represents one genuine improvement over the domestic manufacture that a farm wife of the same period might still be undertaking. But the soap must still be shaved into flakes and dissolved in the hot water, and washing soda, a strongly alkaline substance related in its caustic effect to the lye used in home soap making, is added to help cut grease and lift stains. And handling washing soda repeatedly, day after day, has the same corrosive effect on skin that lye has, drying and cracking and reddening the hands and forearms of the women who work with it. The linen is boiled in the copper, stirred with a long wooden dolly stick or paddle to keep it moving and prevent scorching against the hot metal sides for a period of 20 minutes to half an hour, depending on the degree of soiling. It is then lifted, dripping and scalding from the copper using the dolly stick or a pair of wooden tongs, because bare hands cannot tolerate water at a full rolling boil, and transferred to a rinsing tub of cold water. The heaviest items, wet through with boiling water, might weigh 3 or 4 times their dry weight, and lifting them from copper to rinsing tub again and again, load after load, is a task that engages the full strength of the arms, shoulders, and back. After rinsing, and often a second rinse with a small amount of blue added to the water, a substance called laundry blue that counteracts the natural yellowing of white fabric and produces the crisp, brilliant white that a household like Ashcombe Hall would insist upon. The linen must be wrung. Before the mangle, wringing was done entirely by hand, twisting the fabric between 2 people or against a fixed point to force out as much water as possible before hanging. Ashcombe Hall has a mangle, a mechanical device with 2 wooden rollers turned by a hand crank, through which wet linen is fed, to press out water more efficiently than hand wringing alone. The mangle is an improvement, in the sense that it reduces some of the raw physical force required, but operating it is its own considerable labor, feeding heavy, dripping fabric evenly between the rollers while turning a crank that resists with real mechanical force for load after load, hour after hour. Then hanging on lines strung in the drying yard behind the laundry building, weather permitting, or on wooden racks called clothes horses set up inside the laundry itself when rain threatens, which requires its own careful attention because linen left too long in a damp, enclosed space develops mildew that can ruin fine fabric permanently. And then, only then, comes ironing, which is its own full day of labor and which we will return to shortly, because ironing in a July laundry with flat irons heated on a stove that must itself be kept at a high, steady heat regardless of the outdoor temperature, is perhaps the single most physically punishing task in the entire Victorian domestic calendar. This is what produced the tablecloth on the lawn this afternoon. Not a machine, not an afternoon's light effort. 3 days of boiling, lifting, wringing, mangling, hanging and pressing, performed by 2 women and occasionally a third, in a building that by mid-morning in July becomes one of the hottest working environments in the entire county. For a piece of fabric that the guests seated at that table will never once think about, because thinking about it was never meant to be part of the experience they were purchasing. And we have not yet spoken of the ironing, which deserves its own careful attention, because it is, by the testimony of servants who lived through this era and later recorded their experiences, among the most punishing tasks any of them performed. Flat irons, the standard tool available at Ashcombe Hall in 1875, are solid pieces of cast iron, heated directly on the surface of a stove or a specially designed heating trivet kept near the range. Each iron weighs somewhere between 5 and 9 pounds, depending on its intended use. Heavier irons for large flat items like sheets, lighter irons for delicate work requiring finer control. Because a single iron cools within minutes of use, losing its effective heat well before a substantial piece of ironing can be completed, Alice and Mrs. Pruitt work with several irons in rotation, one in active use while 2 or 3 others reheat on the stove, a system requiring constant attention to timing and temperature that a modern person, accustomed to an iron with a dial and a thermostat, would find remarkably demanding to manage by feel and experience alone. Testing the heat of an iron before it touches fine linen is its own small art, developed through repeated small burns and ruined fabric before a laundrymaid develops reliable judgment. Alice tests hers by holding the iron close to her cheek to feel the radiating heat, or by touching it briefly to a scrap of damp cloth to see how quickly the moisture hisses away. Too cool, and the iron will not press the fabric properly, leaving it limp and creased. Too hot and it will scorch, potentially ruining a piece of linen that took 3 days of prior labor to reach this stage, a mistake serious enough that a young laundry-maid might reasonably fear the consequences of reporting it to Mrs. Pruitt. The stove that heats these irons must, of course, be kept burning throughout the entire ironing process, which for a household the size of Ashcombe Hall during the height of the summer season can consume the better part of a full working day. This means that on top of the ambient heat radiating from the coppers used in the earlier stages of washing, the laundry room during ironing day carries the additional heat of a continuously stoked stove, pushing the working temperature higher still, often approaching or exceeding 100 degrees by early afternoon. Alice's hands, over 6 years, have accumulated a small constellation of pale scars from irons that brushed against her skin in moments of distraction or simple bad luck. The inevitable cost of handling heavy, superheated metal for hours at a stretch, day after day, season after season. The largest scar, on the inside of her left wrist, dates from her 2nd year in service, when an iron slipped from its resting position on the stove and fell against her arm before she could pull away. She remembers the specific, searing quality of that pain with a clarity that 6 intervening years have not dulled, and she has been, if anything, more careful since. Though carefulness alone cannot eliminate the risk inherent in the work itself. By the end of a full ironing day, Alice's forearms ache with a specific, deep fatigue that comes from the repeated pressing motion, arm extended, weight applied, arm withdrawn, repeated hundreds of times across the surface of dozens of garments and household linens. Her back aches from standing at the ironing board for hours without significant pause. Her palms carry the particular calluses that come from gripping an iron's wooden handle for a working lifetime. And the tablecloth that results from all of this, pressed smooth and crisp and gleaming, will be laid on a table this afternoon, admired for its flawless white perfection, and never once connected by anyone seated at that table to the specific physical cost of its production. There is a social meaning embedded in that white linen that deserves its own moment of attention, because whiteness itself, in Victorian England, functioned as a kind of visible currency, a signal of status that only the truly wealthy could reliably afford to display. Keeping fabric brilliantly white required constant, expensive maintenance. The soap, the blue, the labor, all of it representing resources that a poorer household simply could not spare on the same scale. A country house that could produce and maintain a gleaming white tablecloth week after week, luncheon after luncheon, throughout an entire summer season, was making a statement as clear and as deliberate as any spoken word. A statement about wealth, about staff, about the sheer quantity of invisible labor a family could command without ever needing to discuss it directly. Alice understands this dynamic, in her own hands-on way, better than most of the guests who will admire the tablecloth this afternoon. She knows precisely how much labor a single stain requires to remove, how carefully a scorch mark from an overheated iron must be avoided, how the particular brilliance of Ashcombe Hall's linen compares to the slightly less pristine standard maintained at smaller, less well-staffed households in the surrounding countryside. The whiteness of the tablecloth is not, to Alice, a natural or effortless quality. It is a standard she is responsible for achieving and maintaining day after day, and its visible perfection represents, to her professional eye, a measure of her own skill and diligence, quite as much as it represents, to the family's guests, a measure of the household's general prosperity and refinement. For Alice, the hierarchy below stairs presented its own particular challenge on a day like this one. Because Alice's exhaustion did not exist in isolation. It existed inside a rigid social system that determined not only how hard she worked, but how she was permitted to exist within the household at all. The servants' hall at Ashcombe Hall operates according to a hierarchy nearly as fixed and formal as the one governing the family upstairs, and understanding that hierarchy is essential to understanding what Alice's body and Alice's day actually belong to. At the top sits the butler and the housekeeper, who oversee the male and female staff respectively, and who dine separately from the rest of the servants in a small room known as the Pug's Parlour, a privilege that marks their status as clearly as any title. Below them come the lady's maid and the valet, who attend directly to Sir Edward and Lady Pemberton, and who occupy a position of relative comfort and closeness to the family that a laundry maid can only imagine. Which is precisely why Alice practices her handwriting by candlelight, hoping to climb toward exactly that position. Below the lady's maid and valet come the footman, the cook, and the head housemaid. Below them, the under-housemaids, the kitchen maids, and Mrs. Pruitt as head laundry maid. And at the bottom of the indoor hierarchy sits Alice, the under-laundry maid, along with the scullery maid, the two positions considered the least skilled and the most physically punishing in the entire household, reserved for the youngest and most junior staff, the girls who have not yet proven themselves capable of anything requiring more discretion or delicacy than boiling water and scrubbing pots. This hierarchy determines everything about Alice's existence within the house. It determines where she eats, at the far end of the servants' hall table, seated according to rank, speaking only when spoken to by anyone above her in seniority. It determines when she eats, after the family has been served and before the more senior servants, on a schedule dictated entirely by the needs of those above her. It determines what she wears, a uniform specified in exact detail by the housekeeper, with no room for personal choice beyond the small, private satisfaction of keeping her one good collar as white as her skills allow. It determines whether she is permitted to speak to a footman socially, whether she is permitted to walk to the village on her single half-day off each week, and whether she is permitted, ever, to be seen by the family or their guests in the course of her ordinary work, which she is not. Alice's entire job depends on her invisibility. If a guest at this afternoon's luncheon happened to glimpse her carrying linen across the courtyard, that glimpse would represent, in the language of the era, a small but genuine failure on the part of the household, a crack in the performance of effortless gentility that the entire staff exists to maintain.
She works, by any reasonable accounting, between 14 and 16 hours on an ordinary day, and closer to 18 on a day like today, when the demands of an entertainment stack on top of the ordinary laundry schedule. She receives 1 half-day off per week, typically Sunday afternoon, during which she is expected to attend church in the morning regardless. She receives no holiday in any sense that a modern worker would recognize, though she may, if the family is generous and her service has been satisfactory, be given a small period of unpaid leave once a year to visit her mother in Dorset, a journey that consumes most of the leave itself in travel time. Her wages as an under-laundry maid in 1875 amount to approximately £12 per year, paid quarterly, in addition to her room, board and uniform, which are provided by the household. £12 a year works out to roughly 4.5 pence per day. Alice sends a portion of every quarter's wages home to her mother in Dorset, keeping only what she needs for small necessities and the occasional modest indulgence, a length of ribbon, a stamp for a letter, the pencil stub and paper scraps that represent her one truly private extravagance. The body that performs this labor is not permitted to be tired in any visible way. Fatigue, in a servant, is considered a character flaw rather than a physical reality. Alice has learned, the way every servant learns, to move through the final hours of an 18-hour day with the same apparent steadiness she carried at 5 in the morning, because visible exhaustion invites the housekeeper's attention, and the housekeeper's attention, for an under-laundry maid hoping to be noticed for promotion, is a double-edged thing, capable of leading either toward advancement or toward dismissal, depending entirely on what that attention happens to observe. This is the machinery underneath the gleaming table, not simply labor, but labor organized within a rigid structure of rank, invisibility, and constant self-management, performed by a body that is expected to produce a perfect result while remaining, itself, entirely unseen. The rhythm of Alice's ordinary day, on those occasions when no special entertainment is scheduled, still follows a schedule that would exhaust a modern worker within a week. She rises at 5:30. Fires must be licked or checked, water fetched, and the laundry's coppers prepared before breakfast, which the servants eat at 6:30, in strict order of seniority, in a space of perhaps 20 minutes before the working day begins in earnest. The main laundry work continues with only a brief pause for a midday meal until the household's dinner has been served and the family's requirements for the evening have been fully met, which, on an ordinary day, might mean Alice's active duties conclude somewhere between 8 and 9 in the evening. On a day involving a significant entertainment, as today's luncheon does, that schedule extends considerably. The preparation of linen for the event begins days in advance. The morning of the event itself requires additional pressing and arranging beyond the ordinary daily schedule, and the aftermath, the collection, sorting, and initial handling of used linen once the guests have departed, falls to Alice and Mrs. Pruitt in the hours following an event that the family itself experiences as a leisurely few hours in the afternoon sun. There is no concept within this schedule of a fixed number of working hours beyond which additional demands would require additional compensation or even acknowledgement. Alice's wages are calculated annually, a flat sum regardless of how many hours a particular week or season happens to require, and the expectation, understood by every servant in the house without ever needing to be stated explicitly, is that the work required will be performed, regardless of its scope, because failing to do so risks not merely a reprimand, but the loss of a position that, however punishing, represents Alice's entire livelihood and her family's partial support. This structure, in which labor expands to fill whatever demand the household happens to generate, with no corresponding adjustment in compensation or formal limit on hours, is one that a modern labor economist would recognize immediately as a system with essentially no worker protections whatsoever. There is no concept of overtime. There is no concept of a maximum working day. There is, in the entire apparatus of Victorian domestic service, remarkably little that a modern worker would recognize as a right rather than a privilege, granted or withheld at the employer's discretion. And yet, within this system, Alice does not experience herself primarily as exploited, though a modern observer might reasonably apply that word to her circumstances. She experiences herself, most days, as fortunate, relative to the alternatives available to a working-class girl of her background and education. Domestic service, whatever its demands, provides steady wages, secure lodging, regular meals, and a measure of respectability that factory work or agricultural labor, the other realistic options available to a girl in her position, would not have offered in equal measure. This is not false consciousness or simple resignation. It is a rational assessment of real and limited options made by a young woman who understands her circumstances with considerably more clarity than the romantic mythology that would later be built around her era ever credits working women with possessing. The comparison to factory work in particular would have been immediate and vivid to Alice, since two of her childhood friends from Dorset entered textile work rather than domestic service, drawn by wages that, on paper, appeared somewhat higher than what a junior laundry maid could expect to earn. Letters exchanged with one of these friends over the intervening years have given Alice a rough but genuine understanding of factory conditions, the deafening noise of the machinery, the risk of injury from unguarded moving parts, the complete absence of the room, board, and physical security that her own position provides.
Alice's assessment, formed through this informal comparison rather than any comprehensive survey of Victorian labour conditions, is that her circumstances, whatever their real hardships, represent a meaningfully safer and more stable arrangement than the alternatives most readily available to her, an assessment that historians of the period have generally found to be accurate, even as they recognize that both options represented, by any modern standard, truly difficult and constrained choices for a working-class woman of this era. Meanwhile, 2 floors below the drawing room and directly under the kitchen garden, the kitchen itself was its own ongoing negotiation with heat, and the negotiation was one the cook and her kitchen maids were losing from the moment the range was lit each morning. If you picture a Victorian country house kitchen, you likely picture abundance. Gleaming copper pans hanging in rows, a vast table laden with the ingredients of an elaborate meal,
The comfortable, well-fed authority of a cook presiding over her domain. That picture is not entirely false. Ashcombe Hall's kitchen is, by the standards of the working poor in the surrounding villages, a place of genuine abundance, and the cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Halloran, does preside over it with real authority. What the picture omits is the physical environment in which that abundance is produced, which, in July, becomes one of the most brutal working conditions in the entire house, rivaled only by the laundry. The kitchen range at Ashcombe Hall is a large, coal-fired iron structure that must be kept burning continuously through the working day, regardless of the season, because it is the only source of heat for cooking. There is no way to prepare a hot meal without it, and Lady Pemberton's household, entertaining as heavily as it does through the summer, requires elaborate hot meals prepared to exacting standards nearly every day. The range burns from before 6 in the morning until after the final course has been cleared at night, which, on a luncheon day like today, means the fire has been alight, radiating heat into a room with limited ventilation for close to 18 hours. The kitchen maids, of whom there are 3 under Mrs. Halloran, work in that radiant heat for the length of the working day, and the temperature near the range itself, where the actual cooking happens, regularly exceeds 100 degrees in July. Hot enough that Mrs. Halloran keeps a jug of small beer within reach at all times, and insists her maids drink from it regularly, having learned through hard experience that a fainting kitchen maid near an open-range fire is a genuine and serious hazard. The menu for today's luncheon, which Mrs. Halloran finalized with Lady Pemberton 3 days ago, includes a cold consommé, a poached salmon with cucumber, a selection of cold meats, a summer pudding built from currants and raspberries picked that morning,
and an elaborate iced dessert that requires the icehouse's carefully hoarded supply and a considerable amount of hand cranking to produce. Nearly every element of this seemingly light, cool, summer-appropriate menu required a full day of hot, heavy cooking to produce. The consommé must be simmered for hours to achieve its clarity. The salmon must be poached in a large fish kettle over direct heat. Even the ice cream, the one properly cold element of the meal, requires the ice to be broken and packed by hand around a metal canister that is then cranked continuously by physical effort for the better part of an hour to freeze the custard inside it, a task performed in a kitchen that is itself close to 100 degrees.
The absence of refrigeration beyond the limited and carefully managed icehouse supply shapes the entire rhythm of the kitchen's summer labor. Food that would be stored for days in a modern refrigerator must, in July at Ashcombe Hall, be used within hours of preparation, or preserved through methods, salting, pickling, and careful larder management that require their own significant labor and constant vigilance. The larder, a cool, north-facing room designed to hold temperature as low as the house's architecture allows, is checked multiple times daily by Mrs. Halloran and her senior kitchen maid, because meat, fish, or dairy left too long in July heat can turn dangerously within a single working day, and a household the size of Ashcombe Hall, feeding both the family upstairs and 12 servants below, cannot afford to discover spoilage after it has already been served. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The elaborate summer menus that we associate with Victorian country house entertaining, the cold soups and the iced desserts and the delicate salads, required more heat, more fire, more physically demanding labor to produce than a hearty winter stew would have. The lightness of the meal on the plate had almost no relationship to the heaviness of the labor required to place it there, and the kitchen maids who produced that lightness spent their entire summer working in conditions that, by any modern occupational safety standard, would be considered actively dangerous. The specific dangers of summer food preparation extended well beyond the heat itself. Milk and cream, essential to a proper summer menu with its custards and iced desserts, spoil considerably faster in warm weather, and the household's dairy, a small stone building kept as cool as its limited design allows, requires constant monitoring by whichever kitchen maid has been assigned that responsibility for the week. Mrs. Halloran has developed over her many years in the kitchen an almost instinctive sense for the earliest signs of spoilage, a faint change in smell, a slight curdling texture that allows her to catch problems before they reach the family's table. But the margin for error narrows considerably in July compared to the safer conditions of winter, when cold naturally preserves what heat now actively degrades. The salmon for today's luncheon arrived from the nearest coastal town early that morning, packed in ice for the journey, and required immediate attention upon arrival because fish, above almost any other food, deteriorates rapidly in warm conditions and carries genuine risk of illness if served past its safe window. Mrs. Halloran inspected it personally the moment it arrived, checking the clarity of the eyes and the firmness of the flesh with the practiced expertise of a woman who has, over decades, learned to trust her own senses as the only reliable safeguard available to her, since no thermometer or scientific test exists to confirm what her nose and fingers can determine in a matter of seconds. This constant, low-level vigilance against spoilage represents its own form of invisible labor, a mental and sensory burden carried primarily by Mrs. Halloran and her senior kitchen maid, layered on top of the purely physical demands of cooking in a room that regularly exceeds 100 degrees. A single serious mistake, a dish served past the point of safety, could sicken not merely a guest, but potentially the entire household, family and servants alike. And the responsibility for preventing that outcome rests, day after day, on the judgment of women whose formal medical or scientific training amounts to nothing beyond decades of accumulated practical experience, passed down from one generation of cooks to the next through observation and hard-won trial and error. The ice itself, essential to the day's more delicate dishes, represents another layer of seasonal labor rarely considered by anyone above stairs. It was cut from the estate's ponds during the previous winter, when the ice reached sufficient thickness
and stored in the ice house, a deep, insulated pit dug into a shaded slope and packed with straw, where it slowly, gradually melts across the following months, never quite lasting through a full summer season without careful rationing. Mrs. Halloran monitors the remaining supply as closely as she monitors any perishable food, aware that a particularly demanding stretch of entertaining, such as the run of luncheons and dinners the householders hosted this July, can deplete a season's ice reserves faster than anticipated, leaving the household without this crucial resource for the final, hottest weeks of summer when it would be needed most. Now, the garden. Because the kitchen garden at Ashcombe Hall, 4 acres of neatly kept beds and glasshouses tucked behind a high brick wall to the east of the main house, was its own site of considerable summer labour, and it was labour that carried an added layer of social complication that the laundry and kitchen work did not.
The roses on this afternoon's table, the currants and raspberries in the summer pudding, the cucumbers accompanying the salmon, all of it was grown, tended and harvested within that walled garden, primarily by 2 garden women employed separately from the indoor staff who worked under the head gardener's direction through the growing season. Their labour was outdoor labour, which, in July, meant sustained exposure to direct sun for hours at a stretch, weeding, picking, tying up climbing plants, and gathering the daily harvest that the kitchen required. And here is where the social complication enters. A suntan in 1875 was not a mark of health or leisure as it would become in the following century. It was, for a woman of any social standing above the labouring classes, a mark of exactly the opposite. A visible sign that a person spent her days working outdoors rather than being conveyed by carriage between shaded indoor pursuits. Pale skin was a marker of gentility, of a life spent indoors or under a parasol, and Lady Pemberton and her guests, seated under their canvas awning specifically to avoid the sun, would have regarded a sun-browned complexion with the same instinctive social judgment that a modern person might apply to a stained uniform. The garden women who produced the flowers and fruit that decorated the luncheon table today therefore carried, quite literally on their skin, the visible evidence of the labour that the entire event was designed to conceal. Their hands were rough and browned, their forearms exposed by necessity to the sun for hours of daily bending and reaching among the beds, showed a deep tan that marked them immediately, to anyone who cared to look, as working women. And because that marking was so immediate and so socially legible, the garden women, like Alice in the laundry, were kept as invisible as the work itself allowed, harvesting in the early morning hours before the family rose, or working in sections of the garden shielded from the house's principal windows, so that the labour could continue without the sight of it disturbing the impression of effortless abundance that the finished flowers and fruit were meant to convey. The physical demands of the garden work were themselves considerable. Picking currants and raspberries requires sustained, repetitive bending and reaching, hour after hour, in full sun, to fill the baskets that the kitchen requires for a single dessert. A crop of soft fruit ripens quickly and unevenly in summer heat, meaning the harvest cannot be scheduled conveniently, but must instead be gathered daily, sometimes twice daily, whenever the fruit reaches the precise stage of ripeness that Mrs. Halloran's recipes require. The garden women worked through the hottest hours of the day when the ripening demanded it, in clothing nearly as restrictive as Alice's, corseted and long-sleeved despite the direct summer sun, because the social requirement that a woman's body remain fully covered did not relax simply because the labour happened to occur outdoors in July. There is something worth pausing on here. The entire aesthetic of the Victorian summer garden, the roses, the soft fruit, the sense of natural, effortless abundance, was produced by women whose own bodies were actively punished by the same sun that ripened the fruit they picked, and whose visible sun-darkened skin marked them as excluded from the very picture of gentility that their labour made possible. The garden was beautiful. The women who made it beautiful were, by the standards of the world they served, made less presentable by the very act of doing so. The walled garden itself represents a considerable investment of ongoing labour beyond the simple harvesting of fruit and flowers. Ashcombe Hall maintains 3 glasshouses along the garden's southern wall,
structures of iron and glass that require careful daily management, even in summer, when the risk shifts from insufficient warmth to excessive heat. Since glass concentrates the sun's warmth to a degree that can scorch delicate plants within hours if the ventilation panels are not opened and closed at precisely the right times each day. This responsibility falls to the head gardener and his small staff, who monitor the glasshouses continuously through the working day, adjusting ventilation, watering, and shade cloths in response to changing conditions that can shift meaningfully within a single afternoon. The peaches and grapes grown under glass at Ashcombe Hall represent a particular point of pride for Sir Edward, who enjoys mentioning them to guests as evidence of his estate's horticultural sophistication. And the labour required to bring a single perfect peach to his luncheon table involves months of careful pruning, thinning, and protection against the countless small disasters, sudden frost, insect infestation, disease, that could destroy months of patient cultivation in a matter of days. The garden women who assist with this work, though their primary responsibility remains the more straightforward harvesting of hardier outdoor crops, understand this delicate, high-stakes cultivation well enough to recognize how much careful attention stands behind every piece of glasshouse fruit that appears, seemingly effortlessly, on the family's table. Beyond the glasshouses, the outdoor kitchen garden itself requires constant summer maintenance beyond simple harvesting. Weeds grow with startling speed in July heat and must be pulled continuously to prevent them from overwhelming the vegetable beds. Watering in a dry summer becomes its own significant daily labor. Water carried by hand from the garden's well to each bed requiring attention, since Ashcombe Hall has not yet invested in the more elaborate irrigation systems that wealthier estates were beginning to install by this period. Insect pests, which flourish in summer warmth, must be managed through labor-intensive hand-picking and the application of various period remedies, since no effective chemical pesticide exists that a Victorian gardener could safely and reliably employ. The garden women's working day, like Alice's, begins early, often before 5 in the morning during the height of summer, both to take advantage of the cooler morning hours and to ensure the day's harvest reaches the kitchen while still at its freshest. They work through the heat of midday when the harvest schedule demands it, and they conclude their formal duties in the early evening, though the ongoing care of the glasshouses and the most delicate crops sometimes requires attention well past the point when the household's more visible servants have concluded their day. Alice has occasionally spoken with one of the garden women, a girl named Sarah, roughly her own age, during the rare moments when their duties briefly overlap, when fresh-cut roses must be carried from the garden to the laundry to be arranged in vases that Alice's section of the household handles as part of her broader responsibilities. These brief exchanges, conducted quickly and quietly in the margins of 2 exhausting schedules, have given Alice a rough sense of how the garden woman's experience differs from her own. The particular vulnerability of sun exposure that Alice's indoor work spares her, balanced against the relative freedom of open air and natural light that Alice's own windowless laundry never provides. Neither girl would describe her circumstances as easier than the others. Both understand, without needing to articulate it directly, that their respective forms of labor simply represent different variations on the same fundamental arrangement. Invisible work performed in service of a visible ease that neither of them will ever be permitted to fully share. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what it would have felt like to be the last person in the household permitted to wash. The question of bathing below stairs at Ashcombe Hall was governed by the same hierarchy that governed everything else in Alice's life, and it was, in the summer heat, a particularly cruel arrangement, because the servants who most needed to wash away the accumulated sweat, grease, and grime of a day spent in the hottest rooms in the house were also the servants with the least access to the means of doing so. Ashcombe Hall, being a substantial and relatively modern country house for its period, does have indoor plumbing of a limited sort. There is a bathroom on the family's floor, with a fixed bath and a boiler that can produce hot water on request, a genuine and significant improvement over the wooden tub and hauled water that a family of more modest means would still be using in 1875.
But that bathroom exists for the family.
The servants, all 12 of them, share a single small washroom on the top floor near their attic bedrooms, equipped with a cold water tap and a single tin hip bath that must be filled by hand, bucket by bucket, with water heated on the kitchen range and carried up 3 flights of stairs. Given the labor required simply to produce a hot bath, full immersion bathing among the servants at Ashcombe Hall happens, in practice, perhaps once a fortnight, and considerably less often during the height of the summer season, when every spare hour of every servant's day is already consumed by the demands of entertaining. On most days, hygiene means what it has meant for centuries among working women with limited water and limited time. A basin of cold water from the tap, a cloth wrung out and passed quickly over the face, the neck, under the arms.
A change of the one spare set of undergarments each servant is permitted, washed on their own half-day off, in whatever water and time can be spared from their single free afternoon each week. Alice, on an ordinary day, finishes her work in the laundry, covered in a combination of sweat, soap residue, and the particular grey film that comes from handling other people's dirty linen for 14 hours. She washes what she can at the cold tap before bed, a hurried, imperfect process conducted in a shared washroom with 2 or 3 other exhausted girls waiting their turn, and she goes to sleep in her attic room, still carrying, on her skin and in her hair, the smell of the laundry, a combination of hot soap, boiled linen, and her own sweat that has, after 6 years, become so familiar to her that she no longer consciously registers it, though a visitor from the drawing-room, had one ever ventured near the servants' quarters, would have found it immediately and unmistakably present. The full immersion bath, when it does happen, follows its own quiet hierarchy. The senior servants bathe first, in the freshest hot water, which has been carried up while it is still truly hot. By the time the water reaches Alice and the other junior girls, it has cooled considerably, and depending on how many servants have bathed before her, it may need to be topped up with fresh, cold water rather than replaced entirely. A compromise dictated by the sheer labor of hauling enough hot water up 3 flights of stairs to provide every servant with a completely fresh bath. And critically, everybody around her smelled the same. The particular combination of hard-working sweat, coal smoke, boiled linen, and imperfect washing that characterized a below-stairs servant in July 1875 was universal among the staff, recognized and unremarked upon within the servants' hall, and entirely, deliberately hidden from the family and their guests, who moved through a version of the house and a version of the summer, engineered specifically to ensure that they never had to encounter it. There is something clarifying about knowing this. The gleaming, effortless world above stairs and the sweat-soaked, exhausted world below stairs existed in the same building on the same July afternoon, separated by nothing more substantial than a green baize door and a set of social conventions so thoroughly enforced that the 2 worlds might as well have occupied different countries. There is another dimension of bodily management below stairs that the era's strict propriety ensured was never discussed openly, and that the romantic reimagining of the period has inherited that silence almost completely. Menstruation, for a servant like Alice, required the same basic management that it required for women across every social class and every century preceding the invention of commercial products. Cloth, folded and secured, washed and reused. But the specific circumstances of service added their own particular difficulties. Alice manages her monthly courses with a supply of cloth rags kept discreetly among her personal effects, washed privately on her own time, in whatever water and privacy her single free afternoon each week allows, since the shared washroom and the constant presence of other servants make any more frequent or visible washing of such items a source of potential embarrassment that every servant, by unspoken agreement, works carefully to avoid. Working through her monthly discomfort presents no exception to her ordinary duties. The coppers must still be filled, the irons must still be lifted. Mrs. Pruitt, in her own younger years, endured the same arrangement, and offers no particular accommodation beyond a slightly softened tone on the days when Alice's discomfort becomes visible enough to notice. a small kindness passed between women who share an understanding that the era's formal silence on the subject does nothing to diminish its daily reality. The heat of a July laundry adds its own complication to this already difficult monthly management, since the combination of physical exertion, restrictive clothing, and cramping discomfort in a room already approaching 100 degrees represents a particular kind of endurance that the servants managing it rarely spoke of even among themselves, beyond the occasional knowing glance or brief exchange of advice about which position at the washtub might ease a particularly difficult day. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture considerably. Every image of a composed, efficient Victorian servant, moving smoothly through her duties with the practiced calm that the household expects, includes the genuine possibility that the young woman depicted is, at that moment, managing physical discomfort with no relief beyond her own endurance and the small, private accommodations she has learned to make for herself over years of practice.
The broader question of privacy, or its near total absence, shapes nearly every aspect of Alice's physical existence in ways that a modern person, accustomed to some baseline expectation of bodily autonomy and personal space, would find truly difficult to comprehend. She shares her bedroom. She shares her washing facilities. She dresses and undresses in the close company of 2 other girls, all 3 of them managing whatever modesty the arrangement allows through a combination of practiced discretion and simple mutual agreement not to comment on what cannot reasonably be avoided in such cramped quarters. Even the small act of tending to a monthly cycle, one of the most private physical experiences any person manages, occurs within this same context of near constant, unavoidable proximity to others, a reality that Alice has long since stopped finding remarkable, though it represents, when examined honestly, one more dimension of the profound difference between her circumstances and those of the family she serves, who occupy private bedrooms, private dressing rooms, and a level of physical autonomy that Alice has never once experienced in her adult life. July 1875 did not merely mean heat. It meant fever season, and everyone below stairs at Ashcombe Hall knew it, even if none of them could have explained precisely why. Typhoid fever peaks in the summer months in Victorian England, and it peaks for reasons that would not be fully understood by medical science for another decade or more. The disease spreads through water and food contaminated by human waste, and in the summer heat, with wells running lower and bacteria multiplying more readily in warm conditions, the risk of contamination rises sharply, just as the demand for water, for drinking, for washing, for the endless requirements of laundry and kitchen and garden rises with it. Ashcombe Hall draws its water from a well that serves both the main house and the extensive outbuildings, including the laundry where Alice works and the stables some distance beyond. The well is generally considered a good one, tested periodically by the estate's own informal standards, which is to say that nobody has fallen seriously ill from it in recent memory, a standard of safety that a modern person would find alarmingly thin. But 2 miles away, in the village where several of the garden staff and stable hands live, a typhoid outbreak began in early July, traced eventually, though not until well after the season had ended, to a shared well that had been contaminated by an overflowing cesspit following a period of heavy rain in June. Alice does not know the medical explanation for any of this. Nobody at Ashcombe Hall in 1875 has heard of germ theory in any form that would be recognized today, though the ideas are circulating in medical circles and will become widely accepted within the coming decade. What Alice knows is that Mrs. Pruitt has told her, in the flat, unquestionable tone that governs most instruction below stairs, to avoid drinking from the pump nearest the stables, because 2 grooms fell seriously ill after a hot afternoon in late June, and one of them, a young man named Davies, who was not much older than Alice herself, died within a week of a fever that left him delirious and racked with the violent, dehydrating diarrhea that characterizes typhoid in its most severe form. The death of a groom is not a large event within the household. He is buried in the village churchyard. His position is filled within a fortnight by a young man from a neighbouring estate. Lady Pemberton sends a small sum of money to his family, a customary gesture that acknowledges the loss without disrupting, in any visible way, the rhythm of the summer season, which continues, luncheon after luncheon, exactly as scheduled. But below stairs, Davies's death sits differently.
Alice knew him. Not well, but well enough to have exchanged pleasant words across the servants' hall table on the rare occasions their duties intersected. His death is a reminder, one that every servant at Ashcombe Hall carries quietly through the remainder of the summer, that the same heat producing the elegant, effortless entertainments on the lawn is also the heat in which disease moves fastest and kills most efficiently, and that the servants, who work closest to the water sources, the animals, and the physically demanding outdoor and near-outdoor labor of the summer season, are considerably more exposed to that risk than the family they serve. The medical understanding available to treat typhoid, should it strike, is almost entirely inadequate. There is no antibiotic. There is no reliable treatment beyond supportive care, keeping the patient hydrated, managing the fever as best as cool cloths and quiet can manage it, and waiting to see whether the body's own resources are sufficient to survive an illness that kills, even among the reasonably well-nourished, in a meaningful percentage of cases. A doctor summoned from the nearest town, a journey of some hours, might arrive to confirm the diagnosis and offer little beyond the same supportive measures the household could have managed on its own, at a fee that a servant's family could rarely afford, and that the estate would only cover for its own staff in the most severe circumstances. The summer diarrhea that afflicts infants and young children across England in these same hot months, a phenomenon so common and so consistently deadly that it appears in the mortality statistics of the era as a distinct and significant category of infant death, follows the same basic pattern of contaminated water and food spoiling faster in summer heat. Alice's younger siblings, back in Dorset, are old enough now to have survived the most vulnerable years, but she remembers, from her own childhood, a summer when a cousin's infant died within days of a sudden onset of the same violent digestive illness, and the memory sits alongside her awareness of Davies's death as one more piece of evidence that the season everyone romanticizes as gentle and golden is, in the medical reality of 1875, one of the most dangerous times of the entire year. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The Victorian summer, in its actual medical reality, was not a season of safety and ease that merely happened to look beautiful. It was a season in which the same warmth that ripened the fruit and warmed the lawn also accelerated the spread of some of the era's deadliest diseases, and the people most exposed to that danger were, disproportionately, the working women and men whose labor kept the household running and who could not simply retreat indoors into shade and stillness the way the family they served was able to do. The class dimension of this disease exposure deserves closer attention because it was not merely coincidental. Servants like Alice worked in closer, more sustained proximity to the household's water sources, its animals, its outbuildings, and its waste disposal systems than the family ever needed to experience directly. The laundry drew its water from the same well that supplied the stables. The kitchen maids handled raw meat and fish in conditions that a modern food safety inspector would find truly alarming. The garden women worked in close contact with soil fertilized by animal waste, a standard agricultural practice of the period that carried its own bacterial risks, poorly understood by the medical science of 1875. The family, by contrast, experienced the household's water, food, and general environment only after it had passed through layers of preparation and handling performed entirely by servants, a system that, whatever its intentions, functioned as an inadvertent buffer between the family and many of the era's most common sources of infectious disease. This is not to say the family was immune to typhoid or other summer illnesses. Wealthy Victorians died of these diseases too, sometimes quite famously. But the statistical exposure, the sheer frequency of contact with contaminated water, spoiled food, and disease-carrying insects and animals fell disproportionately on the servants who handled every raw and unprocessed element of the household's daily operation. Alice's own understanding of disease risk, shaped entirely by direct observation rather than scientific theory,
has led her to develop a private set of precautions that she follows without fully understanding why they work. She avoids drinking directly from any source Mrs. Pruitt has flagged as suspect.
She washes her hands, when water allows, after handling particularly soiled linen, a practice she adopted after watching her own mother insist on the same habit following her father's fatal illness. Though neither woman could have articulated the germ theory that would eventually explain why the practice mattered. She has learned, through the accumulated folk wisdom passed among servants across generations, a set of behaviors that happen to align remarkably well with what modern medicine would later confirm as actually protective, even though the reasoning behind them remained, in 1875, almost entirely mysterious. The fear that accompanies fever season is not the dramatic, acute fear of an obvious danger. It is a quieter, more persistent unease, present in the back of Alice's mind through every hot July day, surfacing most sharply when news arrives of another illness in the village or another servant taken suddenly unwell. It is the fear of a young woman who has already watched illness take her own father, who has buried a cousin's infant to the same summer complaint that claims children across England every year, and who understands, with a clarity that no formal education provided but hard experience has taught thoroughly, that the golden warmth of an English summer carries within it a genuine and largely invisible danger that she cannot fully protect herself against, no matter how carefully she follows Mrs. Pruitt's accumulated wisdom. The household's response to illness among its staff reveals its own quiet hierarchy of concern. When a scullery maid fell seriously ill with a summer fever 2 years prior, Lady Pemberton, informed of the situation by the housekeeper, expressed appropriate concern and authorized the modest expense of a doctor's visit, a genuine kindness within the constraints of the era's employer expectations. But the girl's treatment and recovery remained throughout the illness a matter handled entirely below stairs, managed by Mrs. Pruitt and the housekeeper, with occasional updates passed upward to the family rather than any direct involvement from Lady Pemberton herself. The girl recovered, eventually, after nearly 3 weeks of illness, during which her duties were redistributed among the remaining staff, an additional burden that Alice and her fellow servants absorbed without complaint, understanding implicitly that the same arrangement would apply, without question, should any of them fall ill in turn. This system, informal and entirely dependent on the goodwill of individual employers rather than any formalized right or protection, represented the full extent of medical security available to a servant like Alice. There was no insurance, no guaranteed wage during illness, no formal mechanism beyond the personal charity of an employer who happened to feel sufficiently invested in a particular servant's welfare. A less generous household, and such households certainly existed throughout Victorian England, might have dismissed a seriously ill servant outright rather than absorb the cost and inconvenience of her recovery, leaving her to manage her illness and its aftermath with whatever resources her own family could provide. A real and precarious position for any young woman whose wages represented, as Alice's did, a meaningful portion of her family's total income. Alice has heard, through the informal network of servants' gossip that connects households across the county, stories of exactly this less fortunate outcome befalling girls at neighbouring estates, dismissed while still recovering from illness, sent home to families ill-equipped to support them, their positions filled within weeks by healthier replacements. These stories circulate below stairs with the particular weight of cautionary tales, reminders that whatever security Alice's position at Ashcombe Hall currently provides remains, ultimately, contingent and revocable, dependent on factors, her health, her usefulness, the ongoing goodwill of employers she will never fully know or understand, that lie largely beyond her own control. The reality was, meanwhile, that a servant's teeth told a story quite different from her employer's, and the difference was not accidental. Sugar in 1875 is more widely available in England than it was a generation earlier, following decades of falling prices as colonial production expanded. But it remains a substance whose consumption tracks closely with social class. The Pemberton family's table, particularly during the elaborate summer entertaining season, features sugar generously. in iced desserts, in preserved fruit, in the many small sweetened dishes that a formal luncheon or dinner requires. The servants' table, by contrast, features sugar sparingly, primarily in the form of the small beer and weak, heavily stretched tea that constitute most of the household staff's daily drink, sweetened just enough to make the working day marginally more bearable. And yet, despite this disparity in sugar consumption, it is the servants, not the family, whose teeth generally show the worst condition by their late 20s. A pattern that seems, on first inspection, to contradict everything we understand about the relationship between sugar and dental decay. The explanation lies not in the sugar itself, but in everything surrounding it. Alice's diet, like that of most servants of her class and period, consists heavily of bread, a starch that breaks down into sugars within the mouth just as effectively as refined sugar itself, combined with limited access to the kind of fresh fruit, dairy, and varied nutrition that might support stronger teeth and gums. The family's diet, whatever its sugar content, is far more varied and nutritionally complete, supporting bone and dental health in ways that Alice's more monotonous, starch-heavy diet does not. Beyond diet, the family has access to a dentist, a genuine, if still primitive by modern standards, medical resource that a servant of Alice's wages and status could never afford to consult except in the direst emergency, and even then only with the estate's charitable assistance. Alice already has one significant cavity in a lower molar that has been troubling her intermittently for several months. She manages it the way most working women of her class manage dental pain, with clove oil, purchased in a tiny vial from the village chemist with a portion of her own wages, dabbed directly onto the aching tooth when the pain becomes sharp enough to interfere with her work. Clove oil contains eugenol, a compound with genuine mild anesthetic and antiseptic properties, though Alice knows none of the chemistry involved. She knows only that a few drops, applied carefully, dull the ache enough to let her continue lifting boiling linen and cranking the mangle through another 14-hour day. If the tooth worsens significantly, her only realistic option will be extraction, performed either by the village chemist, who supplements his regular trade with rudimentary dental extractions using pliers not dissimilar to those a farrier might use, or, in the direst circumstances, by a proper dentist in the nearest town, whose fee would consume a substantial portion of Alice's quarterly wages and would require the housekeeper's permission for the necessary time away from her duties. Anesthesia, where available at all for a working woman in Alice's circumstances, means whiskey, or, if the practitioner is more progressive, a small dose of chloroform, a genuine advance over the frontier conditions of a generation earlier, but still a rough and frightening procedure, performed in a chair in a village shop rather than anything resembling a clinical setting. The Pemberton family, by contrast, has access to a London dentist who employs some of the most current techniques and materials available anywhere in England, including, for those wealthy enough to afford it, gold fillings and increasingly sophisticated approaches to preserving rather than simply extracting a troubled tooth. The gap between the dental care available to Sir Edward Pemberton and the dental care available to Alice Tanner is not a gap of degree. It is a gap of an entirely different medical world, occupied by two people living under the same roof, separated by a green baize door and by an income disparity so vast that it shapes, quite literally, the condition of their teeth. Alice does not smile broadly. This is not particularly a habit born of self-consciousness about the specific cavity troubling her, though that plays some part. It is, more fundamentally, a habit of deference, the same instinct that keeps her voice low and her eyes lowered in the presence of anyone above her in the household hierarchy, extended even to the small, private act of smiling. A servant's face, like a servant's body, is trained toward invisibility, toward taking up as little space and drawing as little attention as possible. And a wide, open smile, whatever its dental condition, is simply not part of the deportment that 6 years in service have taught her to maintain. The broader pattern of dental health across Victorian England reveals class disparities as stark as anything documented in the historical record. Studies of skeletal remains from the period
Comparing burial sites associated with wealthy families to those associated with the working poor show consistently worse dental outcomes among laboring populations. A pattern driven by the combination of starch-heavy diets, limited access to professional care, and the sheer physical stress that hard manual labor places on overall bodily health, including the health of teeth and gums, which depend on adequate nutrition and rest to maintain themselves properly. Mrs. Pruitt, at 41, has lost 4 teeth entirely. Extractions performed over the course of her career by whatever practitioner happened to be available and affordable at the time, ranging from a proper dentist during her more prosperous middle years to, in one memorable and painful instance, a traveling tooth puller who visited the village fair with a wagon full of crude instruments and a reputation for working quickly, if not always gently.
She has told Alice, in one of the rare moments of personal confidence that passed between them during a long day's shared labor, that she considers herself fortunate to have kept as many teeth as she has. A statement that reveals, in its very phrasing, just how thoroughly tooth loss had become an expected and unremarkable feature of a working woman's aging process during this period. The contrast with the family upstairs could not be more pronounced. Lady Pemberton, at 45, retains a full set of teeth, maintained through decades of professional care, a diet considerably more varied and nutritious than anything available to her servants, and a life spared the specific physical stresses, the poor posture, the repetitive strain, the nutritional sacrifices that shape a servant's body over years of hard labor. When she smiles, which she does readily and without the deference that governs Alice's more careful expressions, her teeth remain white and even, a small but telling marker of the vast gulf separating her circumstances from those of the women who serve her. Alice's third tooth, the one beginning to loosen on her lower left side, will trouble her increasingly over the coming months, though she does not yet know this on the July evening we are describing. By autumn, the ache will have sharpened enough that she will finally, reluctantly, seek the village chemist's rough assistance. An extraction performed in the back room of his shop with a dose of whiskey for courage and a set of pliers not meaningfully different from those a farrier might use on a horse. She will lose the tooth, as she has already lost 2 others, and she will manage the aftermath the way she manages every other physical demand her body places upon her, with quiet endurance and a return to her duties within a day or 2, because a laundry maid's wages do not accommodate extended recovery, whatever the source of her discomfort. If the physical demands of Alice's day were considerable, the emotional isolation woven through that day was, in its own quiet way, just as heavy. Alice shares her attic bedroom with 2 other maids, and in that sense she is rarely, in any literal way, alone. But the particular loneliness of domestic service in a great house is not the loneliness of physical solitude. It is the loneliness of being surrounded, constantly, by people, family, guests, fellow servants, and yet belonging fully to none of them, existing always within a structure of hierarchy and restriction that governs even her smallest social interactions. The rules governing a servant's personal life at Ashcombe Hall, as at most substantial households of the period, are extensive and strictly enforced. Followers, meaning any romantic interest from outside the household, are forbidden entirely for female servants below a certain seniority, a rule justified by the housekeeper as protecting the reputation of the house and, by extension, the moral character of the girls in her care, but experienced by Alice and her fellow maids as one more layer of surveillance over lives that already contain remarkably little privacy. A maid discovered to be corresponding with, let alone meeting, a young man without the housekeeper's explicit knowledge and approval risks immediate dismissal. And dismissal from a position like Alice's, without a character reference from her employer, would make finding equivalent work extraordinarily difficult, given how thoroughly the domestic service system relies on personal recommendation. This means that Alice's opportunities for anything resembling courtship, friendship outside the household, or simple unsupervised social contact with anyone beyond her fellow servants are almost non-existent. Her single half-day off each week is spent primarily attending church, a required rather than optional activity, with perhaps an hour or two afterward that she might spend walking to the village to post a letter or purchase a small necessity, always under the implicit understanding that her behavior during even this limited freedom reflects on the household and will be noted, one way or another, by someone who will report back to the housekeeper if anything seems amiss. The homesickness, when it comes, arrives most acutely at night, in the brief window between the exhaustion of the day's labor and the arrival of sleep.
Alice thinks in these moments of her mother's small cottage in Dorset, of her younger brother and sister, who she has not seen in over a year since her last period of leave, of the particular quality of evening light through her mother's kitchen window that she has never quite found a way to describe in the careful, practiced handwriting she works so hard to improve. She writes home faithfully, once a fortnight, brief letters that describe the weather, the general nature of her duties, and reassurances of her health and contentment. Letters that, like the frontier letters written a continent away in this same decade, carefully omit the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the small daily indignities of a life spent almost entirely in service to other people's comfort.
Her mother's replies when they arrive are read and reread until the paper softens at the folds, and then tucked away in the same trunk that holds Alice's pencil stub and practice papers, a small collection of connection to a world she left at 13 and to which she is permitted to return only rarely and only briefly. The particular cruelty of Alice's isolation is that it exists within constant, close physical proximity to other people, most of whom occupy a completely different social world that she serves but can never join, and a smaller number of whom, her fellow servants, share her circumstances but not, always, her particular temperament or interests. Mrs. Pruitt is a capable supervisor, but not a confidant. 22 years Alice's senior and separated from her by both age and rank. The two girls who share her attic room are kind enough but exhausted in their own right, with little energy remaining after 14 hours of their own labor for the kind of sustained friendship that might ease the isolation Alice feels. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to women in service during this period, documented in the diaries and memoirs of former servants that survive from the era, and it is not the loneliness of true solitude. It is the loneliness of being permanently, structurally subordinate, of having every relationship with the family, with fellow servants, with the wider world beyond the house's walls, shaped and constrained by a hierarchy that treats a young woman's emotional needs as, at best, a secondary consideration to the smooth functioning of the household she serves. Alice's small rebellion against this isolation is the pencil stub, the practice papers, the quiet, private ambition of becoming something more than an under-laundry maid. It is not much, but it is hers, entirely hers, in a life where very little else can be claimed with that word. The path toward becoming a lady's maid, the position Alice hopes her improving handwriting might eventually help her reach, is itself narrow and uncertain, dependent on factors largely beyond her own control. A lady's maid must possess not merely literacy, but a range of refined skills: hairdressing, needlework of a delicacy well beyond ordinary mending, some knowledge of fashion and fabric care, and above all, a manner and bearing considered suitable for close, personal service to a lady of quality. Alice has none of these skills yet, beyond her improving penmanship, and acquiring them without any formal instruction available to a laundry maid requires a combination of careful observation, occasional stolen moments watching the current lady's maid at her work, and the kind of patient, self-directed learning that has already carried Alice this far with her handwriting. She has, on a handful of occasions over the past year, found brief opportunities to observe Miss Whitfield, Lady Pemberton's current lady's maid, at work, arranging her mistress's hair before a formal dinner, laying out an evening gown with the particular care that distinguishes a skilled lady's maid from an ordinary servant. Miss Whitfield, a woman perhaps 10 years Alice's senior, has shown occasional small kindnesses toward the younger girl, a brief word of encouragement, a moment's demonstration of a particular hairpin technique. offered not from any formal obligation, but from what Alice interprets, hopefully, as a genuine sense of solidarity between women who share, despite their difference in rank, a common understanding of what service demands. Whether Alice's ambition will ever be realized remains truly uncertain.
Positions as lady's maid are limited, sought after by many below-stairs servants with similar aspirations, and awarded based on factors that include not merely skill, but the more subjective judgments of housekeepers and employers regarding a candidate's suitability. Judgments that can be influenced by considerations having little to do with actual competence. Alice understands this uncertainty clearly. She does not permit herself extravagant hope. But she also does not permit herself to abandon the quiet, persistent effort that represents for her the one area of her circumstances where her own initiative and discipline might actually shape her future, rather than leaving that future entirely in the hands of a household hierarchy she cannot control.
This particular combination, clear-eyed realism about her limited circumstances, paired with a stubborn, private determination to improve them however she can, characterizes not merely Alice's specific ambition, but a broader pattern documented among Victorian domestic servants generally. Women who understood, with considerably more sophistication than the era's popular fiction ever credited them with possessing, exactly how narrow their options were, and who nonetheless worked, in whatever small ways remained available to them, toward whatever incremental improvement in their circumstances they could reasonably hope to achieve. The correspondence Alice maintains with her mother, though carefully edited to omit anything that might cause worry, also serves as a kind of private record of her own gradual development, a thread of continuity linking the round-faced 13-year-old who left Dorset 6 years ago to the young woman she has slowly become. Her mother's replies, brief and plain, occasionally include small observations that Alice treasures precisely because they suggest her efforts have not gone entirely unnoticed, even at this distance. A comment on how much more polished her recent letters appear, a gentle pride expressed at her daughter's evident progress. These small acknowledgements, arriving perhaps 6 times a year through the uncertain rhythm of postal delivery between Hampshire and Dorset, represent some of the only external validation Alice receives for an effort that otherwise remains entirely private, conducted alone, by candlelight, with no teacher beyond her own persistence, and no audience beyond the blank paper itself. The light outside has shifted into the long, golden slant of a July evening. The luncheon on the south lawn concluded hours ago. The guests departed by mid-afternoon, and by any reasonable measure, the day's principal event has been a considerable success.
Lady Pemberton has already remarked, within Mrs. Pruitt's hearing, on how effortlessly everything seemed to proceed. For Alice, the day is not yet finished. It will not be finished for several more hours. The linen used at today's luncheon, the tablecloth, the napkins, the various cloths employed in the kitchen and the serving of the meal must be collected, sorted, and prepared for the next wash, before Alice can consider her duties complete. There is mending to be done as well, a torn hem on one of the household's everyday tablecloths, a task delegated to Alice this evening because Mrs. Pruitt's eyes, after 22 years of close needlework by candlelight, tire more easily than they once did, and the finer mending increasingly falls to her younger assistant. Alice sits in the small sewing corner of the laundry room, working by the light of a single candle, because the household's more expensive lamp oil is reserved for rooms the family might enter.
Her needle moves steadily despite the accumulated fatigue of an 18-hour day, a skill so thoroughly practiced that her hands continue their work with only partial conscious attention, leaving the remainder of her mind free to drift toward the small private accounting she performs most evenings. An arithmetic not of pounds and cornmeal, as it would be for a woman on the American frontier in this same decade, but of a different and equally persistent kind. She calculates the weeks remaining until the family departs for Scotland in August, when the household's demands will finally ease into the quieter rhythm of the shooting season, when the linen requirements will drop by more than half, and the 18-hour days will contract back towards something closer to 12. She calculates the amount remaining in the small tin box hidden under her mattress, savings accumulated slowly from her modest wages,
weighed against the possibility, still distant but not impossible, of eventually affording proper writing lessons from someone more qualified than a stack of newspaper scraps and her own persistence. She calculates, too, the months until her next period of leave, when she might see her mother and siblings again, and whether that leave, whenever it comes, might coincide with enough saved wages to bring a proper gift, something beyond the small, practical necessities that usually constitute her contributions to her mother's household. Beyond these personal calculations, Alice also carries a quieter, more institutional arithmetic, the kind shared in one form or another by every servant in the house. She tracks, without ever discussing it openly, which of the senior positions might reasonably become available in the coming years, whether Mrs. Pruitt's occasional comments about her own tiring eyes suggest an approaching retirement that might open the head laundry-maid position sooner than the ordinary course of seniority would predict, whether Miss Whitfield's recent mention of a possible marriage might, if it comes to pass, create an opening in the lady's maid position that Alice, however unlikely a candidate at her current stage, might eventually be considered for. This calculation of institutional possibility, threaded through every servant's private thoughts, represents its own form of quiet ambition, operating within a system that offered remarkably few formal paths for advancement beyond the patient accumulation of seniority and the unpredictable timing of a superior's departure, whether through marriage, retirement, or, in less fortunate circumstances, illness or death.
Alice has watched this system operate throughout her 6 years at Ashcombe Hall, watched girls arrive as scullery maids and slowly rise, over years, toward more senior positions, and watched others remain, through no particular fault of their own, in the same junior role for far longer than their skills and dedication seemed to warrant, victims of nothing more than an absence of available openings at the right moment. The household's summer entertaining season, demanding as it is, also represents, in its own way, an opportunity, since a servant who performs exceptionally well under the pressure of the season's heaviest demands is more likely to be noticed favorably by the housekeeper, whose recommendations carry considerable weight in any future advancement. Alice understands this dynamic clearly, and it shapes, in some measure, the particular care she takes with even the most exhausting tasks, the mending she completes rather than postpones, despite Mrs.
Pruitt's kind suggestion that it wait until morning, the additional, small effort she applies to her work whenever the housekeeper's attention might plausibly fall upon it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that accompanies this constant, low-grade awareness of being evaluated, a mental labor layered on top of the physical demands of the day itself, and Alice has learned to carry it the same way she carries the water buckets and the mending basket, steadily, without visible complaint, because the alternative, allowing her fatigue or her private discouragement to become apparent, risks undermining the very impression of capability and diligence that her hoped-for advancement depends upon. The performance, in this sense, extends beyond the visible labor of washing and ironing into the subtler, equally demanding performance of appearing tireless, cheerful, and entirely equal to whatever the household requires, regardless of what she actually feels after 18 hours on her feet.
The candle burns low. Mrs. Pruitt, finishing her own final task of the evening, glances over and tells Alice, not unkindly, that the mending can wait until morning, that even a laundry-maid's hands need rest. And Alice, grateful but also aware that leaving the mending unfinished means beginning tomorrow already behind, works another 10 minutes before finally setting the needle down. She climbs the 3 flights of stairs to her attic room in near darkness, her candle stub too short now to spare for the journey, feeling her way along a route so familiar that her feet know it without the assistance of her eyes. The heat of the day still lingers in the slate roof above her narrow bed. She undresses in the dark, down to her shift, and lies on top of the bedclothes rather than under them, because even now, well past midnight, the attic room holds the accumulated warmth of a July day that shows no sign of releasing it before morning.
Her 2 roommates are already asleep, their breathing slow and even in the darkness.
Alice lies still for a few minutes, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her, the distant creak of old timber cooling slightly as the night deepens,
the faint call of an owl somewhere beyond the walled garden. She thinks, briefly, of the gleaming table on the lawn this afternoon, already dismantled now, the linen she will wash again in 2 days' time, the roses already wilting in their silver bowls somewhere in the house above her. She will wake in less than 5 hours. The performance will begin again, exactly as it began this morning, exactly as it will begin tomorrow, and the day after, until the family departs for Scotland, and the particular rhythm of the summer season finally, mercifully, begins to ease. Alice sleeps, and somewhere above her, in rooms she will never enter as anything other than an invisible servant, the house that her labour built settles into its own quiet, undisturbed rest. Step back for a moment from the details. Step back from the copper and the mangle, the sun-browned forearms of the garden women, the typhoid that took a groom named Davis, the cavity Alice manages with clove oil, the pencil stub hidden in her trunk. And look at the whole of it. Look at what an ordinary July day in 1875 actually required, below stairs, to produce the effortless, golden afternoon that unfolded above them. There is a pattern here, and once you see it, you will see it in every costume drama and every garden party photograph and every soft focus reimagining of the Victorian summer that you encounter from now on. The first pattern is this. Effortlessness, wherever it appears in this story, was manufactured, never natural. The gleaming table, the crisp linen, the elaborate cold luncheon, the roses cut at dawn, every element of Lady Pemberton's afternoon that appeared to simply exist, ready and perfect, without visible cause, was in fact the end product of a system of labour so extensive that describing it fully has taken us the better part of 2 hours. There was nothing effortless about any of it. The effortlessness was the entire point of the performance, and the performance required an almost unimaginable quantity of invisible work to sustain. The second pattern is this. The body, below stairs, was treated as an instrument to be used, not a person to be considered. Alice's body absorbed heat that exceeded 100 degrees for 10 to 14 hours a day. It absorbed the corrosive effect of washing soda on her hands. It absorbed the postural toll of 6 years bent over a wash tub and an ironing board. It absorbed the risk of typhoid from a well that nobody upstairs thought to question, because nobody upstairs drank from it. And it did all of this while being trained simultaneously to disappear, to take up no visible space, to produce a perfect result while remaining itself unseen and unremarked upon. The third pattern is this. Class in Victorian England was not merely a social distinction. It was a physical one, written into the body in ways that a modern observer might initially overlook. It was written in Alice's reddened forearms and Sir Edward's smooth hands. It was written in the condition of a servant's teeth compared to the condition of an employer's teeth, in the sun-darkened skin of the garden women compared to the carefully shaded pallor prized in the drawing room, in the exposure to disease that came from proximity to wells, animals, and physically demanding outdoor labour, an exposure the family, insulated by their very leisure, largely escaped. The body itself became a kind of ledger, recording in scars and posture and dental decay exactly where a person stood within the rigid hierarchy of their world. And the fourth pattern, the one that perhaps matters most. The women who performed this labour, Alice and Mrs. Pruitt and Mrs. Halloran and the garden women whose names have not survived in any record beyond a wage book long since lost, have been remembered, when they have been remembered at all, primarily as background figures in someone else's picturesque summer. They are the unseen hands in the servants' quarters. They are the assumed, uncredited machinery behind the garden party. Their actual daily reality, the heat and the exhaustion and the loneliness and the quiet, persistent hope of a pencil stub practiced by candlelight,
has been edited out of the picture as thoroughly as Alice edited the truth out of her letters home. Alice Tanner is not a decorative detail in someone else's beautiful English summer.
She is a person in a demanding body, in a rigid world, managing an entire system of physical and emotional survival with a competence that the family she served would rarely think to acknowledge, let alone admire. And the distance between the golden image of the Victorian summer and the reality of the labour that produced it is not an unfortunate gap in the historical record. It is the historical record, understood properly, for the first time. Unless someone pulls the curtain back, which is what we have done tonight. The living history experiments of modern researchers attempting to replicate the physical conditions of Victorian domestic service have confirmed the extremity of these working conditions in ways that historical records alone could not fully capture. Volunteers who have attempted even brief periods of authentic period laundry work using original equipment and original methods report exhaustion within hours that would represent for Alice merely the opening stage of an ordinary day. The heat of an authentic Victorian laundry, replicated under controlled modern conditions, has been measured at levels that contemporary occupational health standards would classify as hazardous, confirming what the historical record, read carefully, has always suggested. That below-stairs service in a great house represented a form of physical labour whose demands rivaled or exceeded many of the more commonly romanticised hardships of the era: the mill floor, the mine shaft, the agricultural field, while remaining, because of its domestic and largely female character, considerably less documented and considerably more thoroughly obscured by the aesthetic pleasures of the world it served. What Alice did on this single July day, what thousands of women like her did across the country houses of Victorian England on similar days throughout every summer of the period, was not merely difficult work. It was a form of labour so thoroughly organised around its own invisibility that even the language available to describe it, effortless, gracious, elegant, was borrowed entirely from the perspective of those who benefited from never having to see it. The below-stairs world developed its own vocabulary, its own hierarchy, its own culture, largely because the world above stairs required that development, required an entire parallel society organized specifically around producing the appearance that no such society existed at all. This dual society, the visible world of the drawing room and lawn existing alongside the invisible world of the laundry, kitchen and attic, operated with a completeness that a modern visitor to Ashcombe Hall might find difficult to fully appreciate. The two worlds shared the same walls, the same roof, the same relatively confined physical space, and yet they functioned, for all practical purposes, as separate universes, governed by different rules and expectations, with almost no meaningful communication between them beyond the narrow, formal exchanges required to keep the household's daily machinery running. Sir Edward Pemberton, in 15 years as master of Ashcombe Hall, has likely exchanged fewer than 100 words directly with Alice Tanner, despite the fact that her labour, day after day, summer after summer, has made possible nearly every comfortable, elegant moment of his considerable domestic life. It is nearly 1 in the morning now. The house is dark and quiet, the family long since retired, the last footman having banked the fires and locked the doors an hour ago. Somewhere above the attic rooms, the slate roof that baked all day under the July sun has finally begun, very slowly, to release its accumulated heat into the cooling night air. Alice is asleep. She lies on top of her bedclothes in the narrow bed she shares this small room with, one arm curled under her head, her breathing slow and even in the darkness. Her 2 roommates sleep nearby, their own breathing falling into the same unconscious rhythm that exhausted people, sharing close quarters, often find. The trunk at the foot of her bed holds a pencil stub, a small collection of practice papers, and a bundle of letters from her mother, softened at the folds from repeated reading. You are looking at her now, with different eyes than you had 2.5 hours ago. You know things about her that the gleaming table on the lawn could never show you. You know about the 90-degree heat of the laundry and the 100-degree heat of the kitchen,
the corset and layers she wore through all of it without relief, the copper and the mangle, and the 3 days of continuous labor required to produce a single afternoon's linen. You know about the strict hierarchy that governs even her smallest social interactions, the followers she is forbidden to have, the loneliness that arrives most acutely in the quiet minutes before sleep. You know about the groom named Davis, who died of a fever that the family upstairs experienced only as a small, forgettable interruption to an otherwise pleasant summer. You know about the cavity she manages with clove oil, and the pencil stub she guards as carefully as any treasure, and the quiet, almost audacious hope that one day her handwriting might be neat enough to carry her somewhere beyond the laundry.
You know that the golden, effortless Victorian summer was a phrase describing a performance, staged for an audience that was never meant to see what stood behind the curtain. And knowing all of this, look at her again. Look at her, sleeping in the close, still heat of her attic room, her face relaxed in a way it rarely is during her 16 hours of waking labor. Her hands, reddened and scarred from the copper and the iron, rest quietly against the thin pillow. Consider, for a moment, what the modern romanticization of the Victorian summer always has to omit in order to sustain its particular pleasure. It omits the 90-degree laundry and the 100-degree kitchen. It omits the corset worn without relief through a July afternoon that the family experienced from the shade of an awning. It omits the sun-darkened forearms of the garden women, marked as unpresentable by the very labor that produced the roses admired at the luncheon table. It omits the young groom buried in the village churchyard, not much older than the girl mending linen by candlelight 2 floors below, where his death was quietly, briefly noted, and then folded back into the unbroken rhythm of the season. It omits the cavity managed with clove oil, the pencil stub guarded like treasure, the letters home that leave out everything that might cause worry. The woman in the costume drama, moving gracefully across a sun-dappled lawn in flowing white muslin, existed. She was real. And her afternoon was, by every account, genuinely pleasant. But she was never alone in that world. Beside her, below her, around her, an entire population of women existed whose reality bore almost no resemblance to hers, whose labor made her leisure possible, and whose names, faces, and daily struggles have been almost entirely erased from the aesthetic that continues to romanticize the era she represents.
She is not the invisible machinery behind someone else's picturesque afternoon. She is not a background detail in a painting of English summer leisure. She is a laundress, and a mender, and a keeper of small, private ambitions. A daughter who writes careful, edited letters home. A girl who has taught herself, alone, by candle-end, to write a little more beautifully with each passing month. She is 19 years old, and her body already carries the marks of 6 years of labor that most people who romanticize her era will never be asked to understand. She is not the servant in the background of the painting. She is the person the painting was arranged specifically not to show. And she is remarkable. Not despite the heat and the hierarchy and the loneliness, right in the middle of all of it. Alice is asleep now. Tomorrow the performance begins again. The fires will be lit before dawn, the coppers will be filled, and the machinery that produces someone else's effortless summer will resume exactly where it left off. But tonight, for these few hours, in this quiet attic room under a slowly cooling slate roof, we have seen her clearly. Not the servant, the girl. And that is worth something. Good night, friend.